Hello and welcome to Mobile Interactions Now, the podcast where industry pros share firsthand experiences on making mobile interactions work. I'm Chris and I'm part of the team here at Tentech. On today's episode, we have the conclusion of our conversation with Dr. Mark Smith. On our previous episode, Mark spoke to Gene about AI as it relates to customer experiences as well as a few other things. In today's episode, they get more into AI as it relates to communication and it gets really interesting. So, here is part 2 of our conversation with Dr. Mark Smith. Take it away, Gene.
In our previous episode, we started discussing how AI can remove a lot of friction and stress. More often than not, I count myself as one of those people who get frustrated and agitated by poor service. A recent example, I'm getting annoyed by my bank back in New York that I opened an account with before I moved to Munich. And the customer service is insisting on calling me or better yet, asking me to call them back. And despite the fact that, time zone has changed and write me email or message me. And it's not happening. So how far along are we really to get that kind of benefit into a mainstream economy like banking in my case?
Very interesting question. And banking exposes some very interesting challenges. I was with an insurer, actually, a few weeks ago, a man who was not dissimilar age to me, sort of late 40s. And he said, and I quote, "There is software in this company which is as old as me." Now, it's very difficult to understand how that can be true, and he was probably exaggerating a bit, but a lot of financial institutions, the sort of core brain of what they do, can be somewhat archaic. And if it is, the desire and the ability of smaller companies such as mine to actually solve their problems, there is a disconnect between those two things. If there isn't data availability in a sensible way that's presented in some beautiful API to allow, my cloud service to pick that up and fire off secure messaging to people about this, that, and the other, then I can't do anything. However, it is as clear as night and day that you have to do this. Your example with the bank in New York, and you're in a different time zone. Well, I know a bank in mainland Europe who did something which really was quite a surprise to me that they thought like this, and it was a huge pleasure. And they said this: if you can test the best time of day to reach people, and that's a relatively simple thing to do, take 10,000 customers, communicate with 1,000 of them at 30-minute increments during, acceptable hours from maybe 7 in the morning till 8 at night, and then draw a graph and see where most people are receptive. Then, if you prove that, I will change the shift patterns of my people to match my customers' desire and availability to respond. Now, that is customer service. Calling you because it happens to be 2:00 in New York when it is a different, I'm not sure what my time zones are with Munich, but because it's, you're in the pub then, maybe? I don't know, but I'm making terrible assumptions there, but let's say you were, is not a good customer experience. Being empathetic to the fact that a group of customers are in different time zones, and then either using automated communication because that works for you, or changing the shift patterns of people. It is just got to be like that, because the bank you're with has very little difference in the service from a bank in Germany or a bank in San Francisco or a bank in London. So customer service will be the differentiator. They either get on the train or their train stops.
A little side question, because you just mentioned automation. What would you say for people who are thinking AI is just a way to get to automation?
Yeah, I don't have a apocalyptic view of a sort of dystopian future where I'm just, fed by tubes and machines are doing everything for me, or maybe have taken over the world and firing large guns at me. I don't think that's the way technology works. My answer to the question of automation and the relationship between the carbon and the silicon, the human and the machine, is captured rather nicely. No one's ever really adequately explained this to me either, by this thought. So in my country, we have the most people who have ever been employed ever. Our population's increased, which partly explains it, but we have something in the region of 3.5–4% unemployment. Now, there are some economists can be brutal people. There are some economists that argue that that is in effect zero unemployment, because there will always be a small group of people between jobs or what have you. So how do you explain this then? Today is the most technically advanced we have ever been, by definition. And yet, in my country, there are more people employed than there ever have been, and that's with a progressive tax system and a minimum wage. How's that happening then? Now, I've lived quite a long time, and I've seen these sort of apocalyptic views of what technology is going to do, robots in the car industry, AI in medicine, all this kind of stuff. Well, it's not happened, right? It didn't happen. It changed. People started doing different things, but people should be used where people are best and machines used where machines are best. To be honest, I'd rather my car was made by a machine, not some guy on a Friday afternoon who's not feeling so well, right? So there are moments where automation is absolutely fine, and it will always be a synergistic relationship between the machine and the human.
Okay, with that bright picture, let's try to help businesses to get started a little bit. You mentioned looking at a transactional level versus differently. So is there something of a good indicator how ready you are to embark on integrating AI into their customer experience?
Companies certainly seem to be open to doing this. I think I'm fearful sometimes that there are a lot of sort of mid-sized vendors that will. I've come across this quite often, where a company will say, "Well, I've got this magic widget that can do these things," and I'll say, well, "Can I see your magic widget? Can I just test the magic widget out, please?" And they said, "Yeah, of course you can. All you need to do is sign this contract for my most recent one." For a fairly ordinary piece of software, was about £250,000 a year. When I'd stopped laughing, I then said, the bit I said about testing this out and seeing if it works or not, that's what I actually want to do. So I think for corporates, they need to make several decisions. They need to sort their data out. There have been, I can remember one occasion with a large travel firm that's in the UK who's in something of a mess, who after 2 hours I stood up and said, "I can't help you because I didn't have a CRM system. So how can I communicate with people when you can't communicate with people?" So I gave up there. So they've got to get their data in some kind of order. But even that can be dealt with, because companies can take data from different silos and bring it together. And then it's just test to see if it works. Take a control group, take another group, and see if the use of that piece of software, whether it's mine or somebody else's, actually makes a difference. Prove that difference. That then tends to lead to the justification for doing something. We've just picked up a contract yesterday for several $1 million a year, where we spent the last 6 months just proving again and again and again against control groups that we are delivering 10–15% delta improvements in a process which is delivering 50, 60, 70, $80 million of savings. And that's the way to do it. So they started cynical. They then became disbelieving. We then proved it. They then said, "Okay, you've won." That's what they need to do. And people like us are speedboats as well, which is helpful because we can do whatever we want immediately.
So it sounds like they don't necessarily have to have a single view of the customer just yet.
No, you can have a sort of a point solution. So one of the things we did with a bank recently was around an upsell conversation after a successful mortgage application. So basically asking people sympathetically, because it's not a monopoly position, asking people after they've got their mortgage with Bank X, would you like to take buildings and contents insurance with us? So that's a very discrete subset of the bank, which is eminently available to us because by completing a loan application form, you've got the money, you've got the contact details, and you've got the permissions to do it. So you don't need to boil the ocean, eat the elephant in one go, all those hideous phrases. You just, why would anyone eat an elephant anyway? Or you just need to demonstrate a small piece of your customer base to deliver something exciting and then say, look at the implications of this across the piece, and then you justify your existence.
Let me just try to capture that, because what you just talked about is sort of knowing your short-term goals that you can realistically achieve versus maybe a more long-term destination you can get to. So can you just help us frame those two things so that we can try to understand and help the motivation internally?
I'm trying to think of a decent analogy for this. I suppose drug discovery is not a bad one. So most pharmaceutical companies will spend an enormous amount of time testing principles out, and it takes a long time to do that and can be very expensive. But at the end of the day, they end up with a product that they can sell. So it starts with some simple experimentation. The experimentation goes to bigger sample sizes, bigger groups. It goes through regulatory hurdles. It goes through further R&D, further refinement, different models of efficacy, different animal testing, perhaps, if that's still done, which I fear it might be, until such time as a drug is then available to make people better. Now, the same sort of approach applies with so-called new technology. I mean, one would argue that AI has existed in principle for about 75 years, actually. So start small, test principle, see if it works. Roll out to more, see if it works, test principle, move towards the product at the end that delivers the benefits.
And this is going to be my last question. And I want to shift the focus from the consumer's point of view. Do we know anything about how they are deciding what they prefer to use? You know, is it privacy, security, whatever? What do they really care about?
It's an interesting question. One of the things that I found most fascinating about my career is I'm old enough to have begun working in an organisation where I had a typing pool, and I'm not joking. I used to have a dictaphone, which is a small plastic rectangle with some tape in it. And I used to speak into this thing, and my words would be magically recorded and then placed in an envelope. And a man called Frank would take that and he would move it to a typing pool. And maybe 48 hours later, I'd get back a piece of paper which I'd correct. And another day later, I get that back, and then I have to find an envelope and a stamp, and I'll put it in the post. Christ, this is not that long ago, right? This is 25, 27 years ago. That's not that long ago. So 25, 27 years ago, your means of communication were pretty much letter and phone call. Email early, but I'm also old enough to remember in my late 20s when I asked a group of well-paid chemical engineers in a room how many of them had email addresses, and two hands went up. So it was slow. It's slow progress. You know, the postal system 200 years. You know, telephony 100 years. Email maybe 30, something like that. Text messaging sort of 25-ish, and then now it's gone boom. So you have hundreds of instant messenger platforms. You have people using communication methodologies that you know are almost unbelievable. You have thousands of different channels. If you choose to dictate terms to your customer, then that is wrong. It's not just the app. It's not just email. It's not just a phone call. It's not just a text message. It's not just WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger, nor should it be. I'll come back to that one day, but nor should it be. It's not just Alexa or Google Home, etc., etc., etc. It's arguably all of those. And then you can do one of two things. You can, God forbid, ask the customer which channel they would prefer. Not very hard. Why not do that? Or you cycle across the channels, which is what we do, until such time as they respond on one, and then we carry on the conversation on that channel until such time as they choose to tell us that they don't want to communicate on that channel. Or we can do some really interesting things with language. This is lovely, where someone will have opted in for, say, a text message conversation, and we communicate in any language, of course. And then we write to them in English, and they respond to us in, say, Spanish. We can recognize that, go back to them and say, would you like future communication, and we'd say in Spanish, would you like future communication to be in Spanish? And if they come back and say, sí, presumably, then is that right? Englishman displays terrible language knowledge. Then we can carry on that conversation in that language. So it's all about customer preference. Either ask them or cycle across until such time as you discover. And if you do that, people will be happy.
Awesome. And thank you for that. But before I let you go, I just have one little fun we have with our guests. And I get to ask, what are the 3 things that you use the most on your phone? And be quite honest here.
Right.
Okay. Amongst friends.
Okay. I'm... Right. Lots of layers of answer to this. So I'll give you a straightforward answer to start with. Music, right? That's the most important thing to me. I spend vast amounts of time listening to certain types of music very loudly to annoy people on trains. So music first. I'm afraid next up is email. Okay. I'm a great believer in correspondence that has more than a few characters. I think well articulated arguments normally take a few sentences. So email is very important to me. And then I actually quite like voice. It is said that listening to someone speak, 80% of the information that a human understands is not the words they've said. So that can be there's a word called prosody, which is all the sort of underlying subtlety in voice. I'm doing it now. I'm slightly slowing down. I'll slightly accelerate. I'll change the volume and pitch and tone. And you can tell tiredness in voice, and you can tell happiness in voice. Salespeople are told when they speak on the phone to smile when they talk, because humans can tell if someone's smiling when they speak. They really can, right? So there's all sorts of value in voice that I find tremendously helpful. So it's those 3 things. I don't do social media. I have all the accounts very early on in all social platforms. I'm just not very social.
Yeah, but you're a heavy user of communications tools, obviously, yes. Email and voice. Yes. So there you go. Just simply awesome. I thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you again to Dr. Mark Smith for joining us today and on our previous episode. You can find out more about Dr. Smith and ContactEngine at ContactEngine.com. To find out more about Gene and Tintech, visit Tintech.com. Make sure to search for Mobile Interactions Now in Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or anywhere else podcasts are found, and click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. So, on behalf of the team here at Tintech, thanks for listening.